Shooters are in a tough place. They're violent and visceral, which makes them intense and thrilling, but also fleeting and forgettable. In the thousands of online matches and enemies spawn, to the hundreds of campaigns and millions of bullets fired, rarely does it lead to us, the player, thinking beyond that immediate sensation. And even when it does, the game's quality can still be lost in an ether of releases that don't so much as make a dent. But it's this exact market that resulted in one of the most discussed, yet least played video game experiences out there. I and many others presume Spec Ops: The Line to be a name pulled out of a hat. But Spec Ops was actually a franchise from the late 90s. This was a golden age for nearly every genre and platform. Stealth, shooters, RPGs, strategy, simulation, arcade, story, multiplayer, sci-fi, fantasy, you name it, and this period had it. But among the Half-Lives, Thieves, and Rainbow Sixes, there's plenty of games and aspiring franchises that were left behind. Spec Ops was one of them. In fact, at this time of recording, the only review on the original game, Rangers Lead the Way, is by Examine Life of Gaming, a channel that intentionally covers forgotten PC games. While its creator Zombie Studios committed with 2 full games and mission packs, the series moved to the PlayStation, despite the next generation having already arrived. By this point, other developers took over, and Take-Two acquired the publishing rights, spamming out 4 games between 2000 and 2002 with low price tags and even lower reception. While these cheap games may have cashed in on the military and tactical shooter trend, Rainbow Six, Counter-Strike, and Operation Flashpoint had greatly impacted the industry. Seemingly aware of this, Take-Two, now the owners of Rockstar, acquired a team who had proper experience in this field. Barking Dog Studios was a developer based in British Columbia that assisted with Counter-Strike and created their own military game, Global Operations. Being a perfect fit for Spec Ops, they were rebranded as Rockstar Vancouver and set to work on bringing a new Spec Ops experience to the PlayStation 2. Details on this game are limited to a few concept drawings of characters and that Queens of the Stone Age's founder was writing music for it. Whether this spoke to a higher level of production, or the musical equivalent of blowing your meager budget on a well-known actor, something that still goes on today, we may never know, because Rockstar Vancouver's military shooter was cancelled by Take-Two in 2005. The greatest issue with Spec Ops was, unlike its competition that clearly fit within niche sectors of the market, neither its developer nor publishers seemed to know what defined it other than being military-themed. And one look at any art form confirms just how broad that spectrum is. Having acquired a developer based on how good of a fit they'd be for the franchise, and failing, Take-Two decided to open its doors and have developers come to them instead, calling for pitches that would hopefully pull this tired franchise out of the muck. What happens next is difficult to piece together, as many of the articles, interviews, and information about the line's birth and development is contradictory or unverified. From the research I've done, this is the clearest narrative I've been able to assemble. In 2006, German-based developer Jaeger pitched their own project to 2K, one subsidiary of Take-Two Interactive. It was a third-person squad-based shooter, mechanically identical to the final product, but lacked the Dubai setting and story. While the publisher liked Jaeger's concept, 2K revealed to the small developer that they internally greenlit the revival of Spec Ops and offered Jaeger to repackage their pitch into an installment for this franchise. Flattered, Jaeger declined, saying that the brand didn't fit with what they had in mind for a project. Until, for reasons that can only be theorized, Take-Two said the words that very few game developers, beyond Ironstorm, ever got to hear: no restrictions. As long as Jaeger made a military-themed game with the Spec Ops name, they could do whatever they wanted. Needless to say, Jaeger accepted 2K's offer, and all the company's founders and half of its staff got to work. Development began in 2007, during the time when shooters were beginning to move away from Halo science fiction into Battlefield and Call of Duty's ripped from the headlines modern military style. It was hugely successful, and many publishers began to step up to the plate in cashing in, not unlike Take-Two had done with Spec Ops in 2000. But neither developer nor publisher desired repeating that. While the story and themes were bare as bones at this stage, Jaeger knew that it couldn't be thrown to the side. They hired German writers to produce the narrative, but decided early on that they needed an American to write this tale about American soldiers. This is what led to Jaeger working together with their publisher 2K, and having them directly assist. In 2008, 2K brought in Corey Davis as lead designer, Walt Williams as the lead writer, and Richard Pearcey as co-writer. The first had actually pitched a futuristic shooter to 2K around the same time Jaeger did, and after completing Condemned 2 Bloodshot, was informed by the publisher of what Jaeger was trying to develop. With Corey Davis and Walt Williams having lived through horrific storms in America, the team incorporated an element from Davis's pitch to 2K that had become critical to the line's experience: the setting of Dubai. The project gained lots of traction, hiring all the cast members during this period and innovating with their brutal storytelling in unique combat scenarios. Going as far to reveal the game in 2009, the vertical slice impressed gamers with its fidelity and potential of manipulating the environment in real-time gameplay, as well as the moral choices that had moved beyond good or evil. The project only gained more enthusiasm from the developers and publisher. The speculation that Spec Ops was a game the developer tricked a publisher into making is almost the opposite of truth. 2K and Jaeger were working hand in hand with this project, almost every step of the way. Producers such as Greg Kasavin, who eventually departed from 2K to found Supergiant Games, were passionate about the sort of game that Spec Ops was looking to be. But E3 2010 didn't capture the surreal darkness of Spec Ops' reveal, and with far more actual gameplay footage, appeared to be just another military shooter in a rapidly oversaturated market. And with the game's release date being pushed from 2011 to 2012, only lowered expectations. With gamers having to wait almost 4 years since its reveal, many forgot about it. The game had gone through many alterations, not in mechanics but in pacing and plot. Differences in the order of events and sections of levels can be seen in the trailers compared to the final product. And there was also much contention with Jaeger and 2K when it came to multiplayer. Jaeger's publisher didn't give many boxes to check, but one of them was a competitive progression-based multiplayer component. And despite discussing it as early as 2010, it's evident, due to reasons that will be discussed later, that the multiplayer's development must have had far less time than that. But ultimately, through all the trial and tribulations, after 5 years of development, Spec Ops: The Line was finally completed and released in summer 2012. On the surface, just another third-person military shooter. At least in gameplay terms, that's what you'll be forgiven for thinking. The Line has received much criticism for its mechanics, utilizing outdated tropes, clunky inputs, and mindless shooting gallery sequences. Some even go as far as suggesting that the gameplay was intentionally cookie-cutter and dull. But after multiple playthroughs over the years, I don't believe that is the case. Jaeger have stated that the final product is based on their original pitch, and while Spec Ops' gameplay has problems, there's plenty that's done extremely well, mainly in its finer details. While you won't be knocking down skyscrapers, the environment comes to play in many interesting ways. In fact, the breakable windows with sand are probably the least interesting element. They don't alternate the terrain dynamically, and are mechanically identical to the explosive red barrels of killing all enemies within a radius. Better are how explosives kick up sand, potentially stunning enemies and blinding them. But because the grenades that do this are also your lethal explosives capable of killing multiple enemies, you often have to choose between using them directly against the enemy or sacrificing one of your items to allow you to push farther. Having to make decisions like this on the battlefield is unique and far more interesting than simply giving you the full selection of frag, flash, and smokes. Like any game, these more in-depth mechanics aren't necessary on lower difficulties, but become extremely useful on higher ones. Other touches, such as a blind fire function that's actually useful, squad members that can handle themselves and kill a decent amount of enemies, smoothly peeking around corners unlike other third-person games, muzzle flashes and disabled trajectory during sandstorms, and the different enemy classes raise Spec Ops above mediocrity. It alternates from average to impressive depending on the level design, weapons, and enemies. Chapters 1 through 5 are mostly average, with flat geometry, overly convenient cover placement, and almost one type of enemy exclusively, not counting 2 knife rushers and the occasional shotgunner. 6 and 7 is when the game picks up, with a section that strips you of ammunition and support, close quarters combat, a surreal set piece, and both gorgeous and horrific scenery. This mostly goes for chapters 8 through 12, with the exception of some tedious checkpoints. 13 drags with open terrain, but 14 concludes with some of the best level design and pacing in the game. It's a net positive, but that's not going to blow you away. Weapons don't have much significance in the earlier portions because whether it's a 9mm or a rocket launcher, the standard enemies go down if you just look at them funny. In classic games like Doom and Halo, the limited sandbox still has a dynamic pace that responds to the player and creates a flow. Pistol, shotgun, imp, and infected is all that's needed to get you strafing, managing health and ammo, and predicting the enemy's actions. Pistol, AR, grunts, jackals, and elites gives you plenty of engaging encounters. In Spec Ops, moderately armed soldiers you can one-shot from the moon doesn't present anything beyond point, shoot, regen, rinse, repeat. Later on, armored soldiers, knife rushers, heavies, shotgunners, and snipers are all thrown at you at once, which forces you to utilize the sandbox given. This largely falls onto the level design. Earlier chapters allow you to stick to one piece of cover and pick off enemies one by one, like a big budgeted whack-a-mole. But this also changes in later levels, with cover that leaves you far more exposed and multiple ways of advancing rather than a strict one-way path. In general, Spec Ops is best when you're advancing rather than staying put, and it seems to be the intended design, with its fast sprint, sand mechanics, and kicking people over cover. Not that it always works. And the controls unintentionally discourage this playstyle. The game isn't very liberal with how you take cover, not accepting corners or diagonal fixtures, and attaching melee and vault to the same button, not even allowing you to bind them separately on PC. Its usage of the buzzword tactical is quite the stretch. Your squad mates mostly take care of themselves, and marking targets for them is only reserved for the most chaotic scenarios. As in most cases, if you're already pointing at the enemy, there's only one more input required for them to be dead. And this goes for all ranges. As mentioned, despite having a variety of weapon types, you'll rarely be in a scenario where you're unable to hit a target. Assault rifles have the accuracy of snipers, shotguns have the range of SMGs, and pistols are just absurd. It's hilarious to hear words such as realistic in old interviews. I've talked to soldiers, and they'd rightfully laugh in this game's face in regards to its combat. What truly prevents Spec Ops from being lobbed into the same bin as every other Gears of War imitation is not the quality of its tools, but how it uses them. The context and scenarios you're put in are what make it stand out. Whether it's glass under enemies' feet, navigating sandstorms, hearing Nam-era pop blasting over loudspeakers, seeing the destruction of your actions, killing American soldiers, in conflict with the innocent, fighting through ruins and luxurious high-rise towers, the situations and creativity put in the levels are what sets Spec Ops apart from its competition in gameplay. But mainly, it's accomplished through story. The narrative is something that you don't so much experience, but descend into its cavernous wake, much like its Dubai setting. Exactly as a protagonist, Captain Walker expects a routine mission based on what he's seen and known in the past. The player is on that exact path. In terms of input and setup, Spec Ops' opening is ubiquitous. In media res, turret sequence, gruff military shouting, the intense opening set piece, the stoic commander, black guy, and smartass. Press A to take cover, 2-weapon restriction, regenerating health, slowly walk with dialogue, the linear tutorial, explosive red barrels, pseudo-stealth, insurgents. All of these, even to a casual player that buys 3 games a year, is something that's been seen before. But as you peel back the narrative, you begin to identify the distinct layers that Jaeger founded with this game. There's an attention to detail and commitment to the narrative's themes, right down to the menus. Being 17 and ignorant to all of the iconography when I first played Spec Ops, this menu was just a menu, with a functional, if bland UI that does its job. Having sat through film school half a decade later, the game is already hinting at all the hell you're about to venture into with both visual and audio cues. On the visual side is the American flag that's upside down, a signal of distress officially in the USA's flag code. This is combined with Jimi Hendrix's Star-Spangled Banner, played at 1969 Woodstock, a version of the American anthem meant to signify the horrors of war. Before you press start, the game is already subconsciously informing you of what awaits. Before a difficulty is selected, you're already on the path of descending like the character. From beginning to end, each chapter gives you a bigger nugget to chew on. In Chapter 1, there appears to be nothing, with a forgettable execution of soldiers and something to do with Americans in conflict with the locals. However, the first piece of the puzzle is in the credits, the special guest being you. In Chapter 2, we hear an American DJ playing licensed songs over loudspeaker in your battlegrounds. In Chapter 3, the locals are led by a US soldier. Chapter 4, the American 33rd fire at you, forcing Delta to start killing their allies. Soon after, a distinct moral choice. Unlike most games that present their decisions with the D-pad or A and B, Spec Ops uses the already existing gameplay mechanics with its choices. It simply adds unique narrative context. But what's great about the decisions is that a lot of them aren't suggested, but are things a player would dream up on their own. For instance, this isn't technically the first choice in the game. Earlier in Chapter 4, the game allows you to kill an American. And at no point is it ever made explicitly clear. The game's subtle enough to simply account for it being a possible outcome. The importance of these decisions isn't to make for a branching narrative, it's to further reinforce the lack of any good deed being done. In terms of decisions, this is one of the few cases where the game allows you to save people, an action that ends up being frivolous due to the destruction and death that you cause later. But it's not until Chapter 8 that the game makes this point unavoidable. For a scene that's come to define Spec Ops, it's fascinating that something similar had been attempted just 1 year prior. Homefront is one of the many military shooters that failed to capitalize off of Call of Duty and Battlefield's success. While the game's multiplayer may have been great, its mediocre campaign utilizes much of the brutality that end up in Spec Ops, but used less intelligently. White Phosphorus is a case in point. In Homefront, the game has spent its entire first half painting your enemies as heartless husks. The white phosphorus is fired by someone else. There's only one character that slightly shows remorse. And there's an accident that serves to heighten the melodrama of your allies you never met being killed. The tone is all over the place. A character's response to saying, "No one deserves to die like this," is, "We stole it from the enemy. They were going to do it to us." There's nothing profound it says about the weapon and its use. It's not honest about ostensibly good people being capable of doing worse than their enemies. And the player has no involvement whatsoever. It's purely shock value. Yet in Spec Ops, similar to the opening, it lures you in with just how ubiquitous its controls and setup are. I've mentioned how the AC-130 gunship mission in Call of Duty 4 completely echoes real-life footage that gives the mission an unnerving atmosphere and tone. But by this point in shooters, that same gunship mission had been taken to blowing up Paris in Modern Warfare 3. Games simply saw the gunship level as a way to mix up pacing. And yeah, it does that. But that's the most superficial reading of Infinity Ward's efforts. Spec Ops is the only one that really highlights just how messed up the context of this gameplay is. The idea of slaughtering soldiers with continuous aerial bombardment with the purpose of making you feel strong and powerful. Speaking from personal experience, what hit me so hard about the White Phosphorus scene wasn't that it's brutal, destructive, and horrifying. Lots of games are all three. What unnerved me to the core is just how casually I did it. How routine it was to fart a laptop screen and play polka dot with missiles, exterminating white blips that might as well have been zombies, only to be forced to walk through your actions and see the effects. The scene obviously doesn't have this effect on repeat playthroughs, but there's no way to steer this into a way of feeling good. The visuals, sounds, and voice acting is so perfectly executed that it's hard to take the piss out of. But the scene does run into some trouble, and isn't faultless by any stretch. Some who've played were able to identify without spoilers that this area of the map is filled with civilians, just by how they're packed together in a way that no group of soldiers would ever be, and that there is no way to not fire white phosphorus at these people, so that when the game is ostensibly blaming them for the actions, it falls flat, and I can't really dispute this. According to a GameSpot podcast with the lead writer, there were discussions of having the story branch out into two different paths from this point, all the way until the finale. But not only would this be nearly impossible from a resource perspective, but in storytelling would have resulted in multiple elements of the plot changing that had nothing to do with the player, and as such, was internally scrapped. There was also a build that allowed you to properly fight against the 33rd in this section. The fight would have been impossible to win due to the amount of enemies thrown at you at once, but it was at least an option. But memory issues on the Xbox 360 and PS3 restricted you to the rooftop. You can still try to fight them, but it's pretty clear there's no option to progress further, enemies instantly respawn after being killed, and it's not exactly elegant. Admirably, the lead writer acknowledged this and wished that it could have been done better. Then again, it still wouldn't have addressed the issue of not wanting to shoot white phosphorus at the civilians. Now, they don't require direct fire. Most players probably fired at the Humvee and killed civilians through collateral damage. But at the end of the day, this scene is going to create a disconnect for players that see its trick. Civilians killed by collapsing sand wouldn't have had the same effect, and neither would have just killing the soldiers. I can't argue that the scene is designed in a way that will work for 100% of players, but I'll argue that it's necessary, and absolutely the game's most memorable scene. Some argue that it's too on the nose and in your face, but due to the amount of subtleties this game has, even in this scene, I respectfully disagree. Walker's reflection in the monitor, the meta dialogue.
You know what it is. You've seen what this shit does. You know we
might not have a choice, Lugo.
There's always a choice. No, There's really not.
The music, the differences in lighting from the beginning of the stage to the end, being able to put soldiers out of their misery, or being called murderers by your enemies right after the cutscene. It's expertly crafted and presented. In order for the game to truly send its message, it needed this scene, both in the narrative and meta context of this type of level in shooters. Nearly every decision comes just after Walker and you, the player, commit one atrocity from the next, giving you a moment to judge two murderers after leaving dozens of innocents in ashes, quickly executing or burning the CIA agent that stole Dubai's water and doomed everyone in the city to death by dehydration, immediately after you helped him do exactly that. All choices are driven by revenge. In your last decision before the finale, Walker has so much less ground to stand on as a judge of morality than the civilians that hanged Lugo. But one of the reasons Spec Ops, despite its brutality, doesn't feel preachy or patronizing is through moments like this, where despite your clear option of mowing down civilians, you can still fire into the air and let them run away in fear. And Jaeger's attention to detail with the civilians, and their different voice lines and reactions, furthers this.
That's right! Run, you fucking coward! Oh shit!
This first layer of the story, the raw events that have occurred, set you up for the conclusion. The moment when the surreal goes into overdrive. The twist that John Conrad was dead all along, and merely a fragment of imagination, is clearly telegraphed chapters ahead of time, and yet it still packs a serious punch. Not by taking what was thought to be real and revealing that it wasn't, but by laying the final nail in the coffin, that neither you nor Walker have done anything that should lead to us being put on a pedestal. The game doesn't pull the rug from underneath you, but rather repeatedly kicks you in the head while you're on the floor. In fact, the ending really started in Chapter 13 after the helicopter crash. Walker's vision has him using the same excuses and lines as his conversation with Conrad.
You gave us no choice. What happened here was out of my control. We tried to save you. We tried to save you.
You're no savior.
This wasn't my fault. This isn't my fault.
It takes a strong man to deny what's right in front of him.
Nolan North was hired long before becoming such a well-known actor in video games. He'd done everything from one of the most popular characters of the 7th generation to background vocals for NPCs in games like Halo. He's done hundreds of games, but this is the one where he goes far beyond providing the believable voice of a soldier for the player to shoot alongside with. This is a full-on performance, and one that successfully grows the character from the opening to this final scene. It's a combination of not just the well-written script and the talent of the actors, but also their direction.
So who's gonna take care of the DJ?
What the hell you talking about?
He ain't passing the torch. We're stealing the man's mic.
3 soldiers against a fat ass with an iPod. I'm less than worried.
Gotta expect the unexpected, Adams.
Adapt and overcome, bitch.
The plot was acted, recorded, and shot from start to finish in chronological order multiple times, to ensure that the actors themselves had the authentic harshness and exhaustion in their voice when Walker and company have dropped the professionalism and become instinctive, violent human beings. In terms of Nolan's work, this is easily the best acting he's ever done, but the direction shouldn't be forgotten, because there's not a single weak link in the cast. The ending is effective, not just because of the scene itself, but in how the entire game from start to finish builds up to it from visuals, themes, and performances. Yet it seems to have finally run into issues with how it portrays the twist that Conrad is a figment of Walker's imagination, that the 2 men Conrad held up were just corpses, that there was no battery in the communicator with Conrad the whole time, and yet somehow your fellow soldiers kept following you. Indeed, it's a twist that doesn't add up because the ending shows dialogue and visuals that never played in the key scenes. This style of twist is not bad storytelling, it's just not as impressive as one that truly gives everything the audience needs prior to figuring it out, rather than cheat and show them something different. These are rather big plot holes, but one scene that you did revisit that isn't brought up here is the chopper sequence, where the in media res prologue and Chapter 12 conclusion have one very large difference.
Wait! Wait, this isn't right!
Well, it's too late now!
No, I mean, we did this already!
What do you mean?
Ah, fuck it! It's nothing! Just shake these fucking guys!
You got it!
The speculation from a few is that there's one more layer to this game's story, from the literal to character and meta narratives, that there's a final piece to the puzzle. I hated this at first. The idea that Captain Walker died in the crash and the whole game is some bizarre flashback, having this one line seemed like a lazy last-ditch effort. But the game is just as meticulous with this narrative as it is with everything else. To revisit the main menu, there's another hint. In the earliest screens, you hear helicopter blades faintly in the background. These clearly reference the in media res crash. Subsequently, as the game moves further from that, the sound effect never comes back, until you repeat the helicopter crash, where it plays in every screen, even after the epilogue. The differences in dialogue between the crashes are apparent, but what's not is how they differ in the way they cut at the end. In the prologue, it doesn't cut to black. It has a faint light with the helicopter's blades pulsing in the background, as if they're someone's final moments. Whereas in the 12th chapter, the helicopter spins out of control, and when finally crashing, the screen plainly cuts to black. Even while editing this video, I picked up on something. As soon as the helicopter collides with yours, there's no more dialogue from your squad mates, and Lugo and Adams can't be seen anywhere in the chopper. But the most damning evidence of all can actually be seen from the very first level of the game, as far back as the demo. From chapters 1 through 5, Conrad's face can be seen on multiple billboards. It not only recontextualizes the events thought to be literal, it even does so for the meta-narrative. Loading screens in the third act begin to kick the player down with lines such as, "How many Americans have you killed today?" and "Do you even remember why you're here?" There's one that says, "But none of this is real, so why do you care?" It's clearly meant to refer to the player's relation to this game, but it may also refer to the events themselves. There's also the amount of times the game fades to white. It's obviously used at times to clearly highlight Walker's visions, yet it even appears in levels like the white phosphorus section and talking to the DJ. And there's the level design and pacing. Forcing the player to make a judgment call after each atrocity committed can be seen from a game design perspective, but it may also relate to the character doing this to himself. It's even in sync with the game's visuals, specifically how no matter what, every level has you descending further and further into Dubai, with visuals and loading screens and cutscenes that clearly refer to Walker staring into the abyss. Even Adams and Lugo play the role of Walker's psyche. Lugo is always Walker's biggest critic, with Adams disagreeing with some of his actions, yet always siding with him until the finale. Their fates are constantly reinforced with some unavoidable scenes, but also in subtle foreshadowing, such as the reflection of a soldier hanging in the spot where Lugo normally is repelling. After all the playthroughs and readings into this game, there is no doubt in my mind that the true narrative here is Walker mentally torturing himself in order to confront his horrific actions. When I play the game today, the only ending that seems right is to finally accept it. But even if Walker doesn't, even if you select what appears to be the closest thing to an escape from Dubai, there's a final line that tells you Walker died, and that this is his personal hell.
If you don't mind me asking, what was it like? How'd you survive all this?
Who said I did?
Some can write off the story in Spec Ops as pretentious or full of itself, as with many films, albums, and shows that don't simply utilize the most instinctive and superficial of storytelling. It doesn't fully work as a literal narrative with the holes laid out by its final twist, but that's because the game is not a literal narrative. Walker has far more in common with television and film characters than he does with the typical video game protagonist. In games, most leads are ones that we, the players, inhabit. They're given deliberately vague backstories and plain characterization in order to make it easy for us to be on the same page. And that is how most video game stories achieve their power, by having you and the character be at least a similar entity at all times, having the same reactions and experiencing the same troubles and triumphs. But Walker isn't meant to be us, and we're not meant to be him. The game's point isn't that we, the gamer, are Walker. Typically in games, we save the day, help people, and the world. Spec Ops' point is that we, the gamer, have far too much in common with Walker.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Spec Ops likely would not have been possible without the collaboration of 2K and Jaeger. It was an unusual circumstance in the gaming industry, and a perfect alignment of talent that came together to make something unique in an overcrowded genre. But 2K is still a publisher, and while 2 of the checkboxes provided were very open to interpretation, the final one was not. Jaeger did not want a multiplayer mode, but it was going to happen no matter what. It was a decision made early on, as foretold by the interviews in 2010 that mention it. But Jaeger would end up being against the idea so much that a portion of their game would be outsourced to another company. Darkside Game Studios was the obvious choice, having also developed the multiplayer for BioShock 2 a few years prior. There is little information on the multiplayer, let alone its development, so any reasoning for how the game turned out to be is entirely speculative. But I thought it'd be better to have an actual assessment on it, rather than just saying it sucks and moving on. But with a population that's emptier than the game's version of Dubai, help was needed. Thanks to viewers that follow on Twitter and/or support on Patreon, we were able to fill up lobbies and try every game mode and map the game had to offer. It took far more effort than expected. This is the buggiest multiplayer I've touched in a long time. It makes early access titles look like they were made by Blizzard. Whereas the single-player game runs smoothly, looks great, and has very few issues in regards to optimization or stability, multiplayer crashes with the frequency to make the Ukrainians behind Stalker cringe. Beyond crashes that mostly occurred in the main menu, there is constant lag regardless of who's host and where they're from, bizarre deaths and hit detection, visual errors, audio errors, and most bizarrely, mouse sensitivity changes that seem to be attached to who's host. And this is before we get into the game itself. It's a cover-based shooter as in single player, but unlike most third-person multiplayer games, the time to kill is effectively instant, with very few circumstances where you'll be able to escape someone who shot first. This encourages you to camp and stay put, but seeing as how the game's mechanics were designed for moving the player forward, there is a constant disconnect when playing online. You have movement and controls that push you forward in tiny maps that have you stopping and turning, with all weapons having the power of a 50 cal. This does have the presumed effect of at least putting players on equal footing. But oh no. Being a game developed for consoles in mind, there was certainly no testing or changes to account for how a 20-round semi-automatic sniper with the precision of a mouse and a fire rate as fast as you can manage effectively snaps the game's balance in two.
Are you fucking kidding me?
And in hardcore, where it's a one-shot kill, forget it. Even the pistols are broken with their pinpoint accuracy.
Okay.
Fuck!
But the worst example can be found through the game's perks, specifically Bloodthirst, a bonus that increases your damage output with every kill by 10%. If that wasn't enough, the level 2 version of the perk gives you 10% armor increase with every kill. This may in fact be the most nonsensical perk I've ever seen in a multiplayer shooter. How something this broken made it beyond someone's inner thoughts is baffling. That's actually the key word for a lot of Spec Ops' multiplayer. For instance, the opposing factions aren't red and blue. They actually have their own appearance and bonus traits. Based on campaign, there's the Damned 33rd and the Exiles. It's a neat idea, but the differences are things like 10% XP bonus for Sandstorm kills, 10% pistol damage increase, 30% damage reduction while on zip lines in fast ropes. An XP boost in very specific scenarios isn't going to distinguish two sides from one another, and damage reduction doesn't matter very much in a game where your character bites the dust if they're spat on. In general, there doesn't seem to be much consideration for balance or counterplay. Based on how buggy it is, I'm going to assume this is down to a very rushed development and lack of devoted resources. I know it's nitpicking, but when a game's end screen is this flat, you know the developers were scrambling to get this out the door. BioShock 2 at least had its text fade in. That, and there's only 6 maps.
And so for now, we're just saying multiplayer will be there. It's a super important part of the game because any military shooter aspiring to be, an excellent entry in like a super competitive and, really high quality genre on the whole needs to have a strong multiplayer component. So that's really important to us. And it's going to be connected to the narrative in this game's case. And it's going to hit all the bases in terms of your kind of co-op type feel, your team-based and your free-for-all types of modes. So there'll be a lot to it, but we're being cagey about the details for the time being.
But there's no depth here. in gameplay or content. Bad design is everywhere.
But I can't. What? Oh god. What?
Later on, you can equip proximity mines instead of frag grenades, and normally when you pick up a box of grenades, you get 3 frags. But you get the same amount if you use mines, meaning that you can spam them everywhere on the map, and they don't disappear when you die. There are bonuses players get for sticking together with their teammates, but they're only icons, so you're never exactly clear what they even are while playing. Hardcore mode gets rid of all UI despite being in a game without iron sights and only a handful of weapons with scopes. And because the time to kill is even faster in this mode, there's no requirement for aiming. Not that you can in the first place. Even the sand manages to be more gimmicky than in the campaign. Because the deaths happen so quickly, there's no time to aim for weak points. If someone's shooting at you, it's going to take longer for you to aim where the sand is than on their body. And because deaths are practically instant, there's no benefit for using the sand. Nearly every kill earned by it in the hours we played was either someone camping a spot waiting for someone to walk into its kill radius, or by complete accident. To cover everything wrong with this component would take ages, so it's better to just discuss the 2 things that are pretty good. Firstly, rock throwing. When playing, you always have a rock you can use as a fake grenade, being able to flush players out of cover thinking there's a frag under their boots so you can pop them in the head. Having an unlimited amount means everybody can just spam these and it kind of ruins the purpose of the mechanic, but it's a neat idea, and something that would fit perfectly in a tense game like Battlegrounds. Second, the mode Buried. With cutscenes that play at the end of each match, it's pretty clear this is where Darkside Game Studios put most of their effort, and understandably so, as it's a far more interesting mode than the bog standard rally point or uplink objectives. And unlike the chaos of Team Deathmatch, has a semblance of actual teamwork. In Buried, both teams have a high-value target they need to protect. This HVT is protected by 3 objectives that need to be destroyed in order for the HVT to be exposed. What results is a game mode that's about defending and attacking simultaneously. Cooperation with your team is necessary for both, as if you attack and fail to destroy one of the targets, the enemy team can simply repair the damage. Meanwhile, if you only attack, you've all but assured that one player can sneak to your base and take down one of the objectives before you get back. It's a legitimately cool mode, and were it put into a game with better design and netcode, it could be something great. But the game's issues hold the mode back from being something to hunt down. The closest I've seen to this game type is Skirmish and Insurgency, but even then, the caches destroyed are attached to your reinforcements and not your base. Something can be worked out if a better game takes this mode. But that's unfortunately all the Spec Ops multiplayer is able to bring to the table. The poor design and execution is only a symptom of the much bigger problem that Spec Ops wasn't focused on multiplayer from day one, and that squeezing it in is like trying to fit dubstep into a showing of the Mona Lisa. Oddly enough, the co-op mode that was added months after launch due to having discussed co-op multiple times in years past is surprisingly enjoyable. All of the levels are built around the game's momentum of pushing forward through the environment, and with 2 players, the amount of enemies is increased to deliver enough of a challenge. But there's only 4 levels, which can be completed in under an hour, so in terms of replayability or content, it's sadly lacking. A shame, because it manages to utilize Spec Ops' gameplay strengths in a way that the competitive multiplayer simply doesn't. Having actually played hours thanks to the people who watch this channel, I can safely confirm Spec Ops: The Line's competitive multiplayer is bad. The multiplayer is easy to ignore. It's akin to a tacked-on DVD extra. It clearly has nothing to do with the campaign, nor does it make Jaeger's work any less brilliant. But it was where many people got their first impressions of Spec Ops, and were rightfully underwhelmed. The multiplayer beta flew under the radar, and its constant appearance didn't hype any potential customer. This same issue can be applied to the game's demo. For as much as many of us may miss demos, there's a good reason why they so rarely come out prior to a game's launch these days. Extra credits goes into far more detail, but there's a lot more scenarios where a demo hurts a game's sales, and Spec Ops is a case in point. The demo is simply the earlier levels, but skipping Chapter 4. The first time Walker brings destruction to Dubai and its citizens, and the significance of shooting American soldiers as an American soldier. And its half-baked narration and story teasers simply make it appear like the ill-conceived child of Apocalypse Now and BioShock. It's been argued by many that the marketing is deliberately misleading to fool players into thinking it's just another military game. But if that's true, then the marketing is wildly inconsistent. Almost every interview emphasizes from the very start that Spec Ops is a narrative-focused game about entering the heart of darkness.
Spec Ops: The Line is an intense third-person military shooter with a very strong focus on a dark and mature narrative.
Spec Ops: The Line is a third-person military-themed shooter with a focus on a dark and mature narrative.
Metal Gear Solid 2 is the example of a deliberate bait-and-switch, and Spec Ops doesn't have the consistency of that marketing campaign. Spec Ops' reveal trailer has the eerie and disturbing atmosphere of the game, but the closer it got to launch, more of the marketing traded that in favor of making the game look like everything else. But without that being the plan from the get-go, it simply made the game lack a consistent identity. The only trailer that effectively communicates the game's tone without spoiling the experience is the Journey trailer. The problem? This is probably the first time it's been seen by a lot of people, and was released almost a full year before the game came out. Plus, it doesn't really illustrate what type of game Spec Ops is. There's nothing here to inform someone that it's a third-person shooter. I understand why the marketing wasn't able to be consistent for this game, because it's not easy to sell. Play this so you feel bad isn't very compelling, nor is it completely accurate. Spec Ops is far more sophisticated than simply making the player feel like shit. Similar to the works it was inspired by, it's an exploration of a mental state, for soldiers with PTSD and gamers with the desire to feel powerful. It's a narrative that begins with a large-scale, objective-driven plot of saving a city's population that evolves into a deeply personal tale of a man mentally torturing himself for the heinous crimes he's committed. 5 years after its release, with all of its outdated tropes, clunky mechanics, and story that frequently addresses the player directly, I assumed Spec Ops would become dated. But in fact, the opposite has occurred. I love it more than I ever have. It's certainly not flawless and shouldn't be treated as such. It should be critiqued and discussed, because there is so much that games and the industry on the whole can learn from Spec Ops. How to make choices through your mechanics rather than cutscenes, having connection and separation between the player and protagonist simultaneously, telling a small-scale story in a big-budget game, how not to include multiplayer, how to use foreshadowing, can your scenes truly affect all players, how large can your meta-narrative be, are plot holes okay if there's another interpretation that explains them. Spec Ops has provided hours upon hours of discussion, debate, and analysis, and I don't think that's going to change, nor do I want it to. Years later, Spec Ops really does hold up, and will always be a game that not everyone will praise, but everyone should play. I want to give an extra special thanks to the people who showed up during the Spec Ops multiplayer play sessions. Having you for an audience is fantastic, but I never want to take you guys for granted, and being able to do something like this, create an entire segment of a video that I previously would not have been able to make had I just been completely on my own, is amazing, and I hope that I get to do this more in the future. The Steam curation page is already at 1,000 followers. Thank you for that, and be sure to join the Steam group, as in the future, I hope to have more multiplayer play sessions like this, and reviving games that people have either forgotten or doesn't have a huge player base these days. Thank you for watching, thank you for supporting, and have a good day.
Say